All right, so we are recording now. So anyhow, but the University of Florida is, they see us as a way to get their research out to the end user, and the county sees us as a service, much like libraries or parks and trails. So that's just a little bit about extension. And today we're talking about mulching and composting. And I just want to give a couple little housekeeping things. If you've been with us on Zoom before, you already know this, but we do have new people Zooming in. So just check the chat box. You're going to see it looks like a little cartoon blip like you would see in the funnies in the paper. Click on the chat box if you'd like to talk. If you are having trouble hearing us, you see my head and my mouth's moving and you're not hearing anything, make sure you click on Join Audio, and that will direct you on how to activate your speaker and your mic as well, which again, all of you are muted at this point, but please feel free to reach out in the chat. All right, so for those of you that have been with us before, know that I do a little pre-test and a post-test because I want to measure your knowledge gain. We are offering the classes for free, and typically we have a small charge for them. So since we're offering them for free, if you will please indulge me by answering the questions on this poll. And hopefully you can all see them. Oh, also we have a couple folks from out of state, so most of this information will apply to you, but some of it will apply specifically to Florida. And also another thing that we've noticed too is sometimes when people join from their phones, they're not able to see the poll. So some of you may not be seeing the poll right now, but hopefully most of you are. And we've got almost everybody. I'm going to give it just maybe 15, 20 more seconds. Oh, you guys are pretty good. I don't know if you need this class. You're doing good with this poll. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now, and then I'm going to share the results. So here we go. Cypress mulch is not recommended by the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, and that is actually true. So most of you got that right, and I'll get into why in a little bit. And then compost is ready to use when yard and kitchen waste is decomposed and no longer recognizable. So no longer recognizable is the big key. So that would be true. So you guys are doing pretty darn good. I don't know if I'm going to get a lot of knowledge gain out of this quiz because you guys are rocking it. All right, check all that apply. Turn your compost pile to, you want to turn it to reheat it, to add oxygen, to break up clumps and layers, and to keep the smell down. So all of those are actually reasons why you would want to turn your compost pile. So turning your compost pile is a miracle worker. It helps resolve so many issues. All right, so I'm going to stop the share results and let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so just a little reminder, again, I'm Brooke Moffis. I'm the extension agent in Lake County. Lake County's in the middle of the state. Regina Doherty's on chat, and Wanda, my office assistant, is here to keep me in line. So, all right, so the 9 Florida-friendly landscaping principles that we're covering is we're going to be talking about mulching, and with composting, we're talking about recycling. So these are the principles that we are hitting this week. Next week, I believe we're doing water-wise landscapes, and the week after that, we're doing attracting wildlife. So here's a yard. This is actually Master Gardener yard, and you can see she has quite a bit of mulch, and we're gonna go ahead and talk about mulching first. One thing that I'd like to make clear to everyone is some people are doing their whole yards in mulch and they're not planting a lot of plants, and we actually don't consider that Florida friendly either. So you want to make sure that if you're using mulch that you have a lot of plant material there in those beds. An all mulch landscape with very little plants or an all rock landscape with very little plants, we don't consider Florida friendly. It doesn't really help build the soil that much. It doesn't really attract wildlife. So I think this is a good example of a Florida friendly yard. She's got a patch of turf here. She's got some landscape beds with some Florida native wildflowers, but she also has some non-native plants that are still really nice to have, like flax lily, and then she has some trees that are going to be really large. They're going to help attract wildlife eventually, probably already are, and then they'll help shade her house too. So cooling costs are important with making sure that you have plants and not just beds full of rock or mulch. All right, so why do we want to use mulch? Well, you want to retain soil moisture. I think the number one thing is suppressing weeds. We all know all the weed issues that we deal with here in Florida. And you can also insulate the roots. You can help keep the crown and the root system cool in the summer, and you can help keep it warm in the winter. And then for an application, we typically recommend about a 3 to 4 inch layer. So put it down kind of heavy, 3 to 4 inch layer of mulch. When it settles, you want it to be about that 3 inch. And then a couple of examples that we have is pine straw mulch. Can be absolutely beautiful. It helps to acidify the soil. It breaks down very quickly though. Another mulch is pine bark nuggets that you see below here. And I actually have a really funny story about pine bark nuggets, which I'll try to remember to tell you all. All right, so other types of mulch, again, any of the wood chips, you can use leaves, pine needles, grass clippings, those could all be used as a type of mulch. Or inorganic materials. And when we're saying organic, we just mean that it was once living. Our inorganic materials are things like gravel, pebbles, rubber, woven ground cloth. So those are some of our inorganic, meaning they were not from a living thing. So with our organic, use as much as your heart is content for your organic materials, because they're going to help break down and build up that soil. For your inorganic materials, you want to use them sparingly. So these are some applications in the photos. This is in a Japanese style garden, where a small garden like this, yes, it'd be very appropriate to use a rock mulch, and it fits with the theme. And then as far as rubber mulch goes, probably the best use for it is a playground or maybe a walkway, something like that. So just in limited spaces. All right, so one thing I want to point out is just to avoid volcano mulching. So this may not look like it's harmful, but landscapers tend to pile mulch up around the base of the tree. And when this happens, you can trap moisture, and then you can get the bark actually sloughing off the tree. And all of the living tissue on a tree is right underneath the bark. I shouldn't say all the living tissue, but our water and our food conducting tissue is right underneath the bark. So if that bark gets wet, my husband is doing something weird with aluminum foil right now and totally distracting me. Sorry about that. But all right, so if the bark gets wet right underneath that mulch, my poor husband, wasn't he doing something crazy last week too? All right, back to this. If you get too much water right up against that bark and it sloughs off, you can girdle the plant, and basically you damage the water and food conducting tissue. All right, so avoid that volcano mulching. You want to make sure you see the root flare of your trees. One of the things that I like to tell people to think of is picture your neck as a tree trunk, and then picture your shoulders as the topmost root. So you want to see your shoulder. You want to see that root flare on the tree coming off. And if you don't see that topmost root, you may have planted that tree too deeply, which sometimes can kill it over time. Or you've got too much mulch piled on top and you need to pull it away. And please let me know if there's any questions or thoughts. And then just a epiphany I had one time when I was out just doing some new fresh mulch in the landscape. I was putting out like this dyed mulch, because that's what everybody else was doing. It was red in color. Not that there's anything wrong with the dyed mulch, but I was putting out this red dyed mulch. And then as I was doing it, it was right in the late winter, early spring, when our oak leaves start to fall. So as I'm putting out all this fresh mulch, the oak leaves are falling, and I'm getting ticked off because it makes it look messy. And then all of a sudden it dawned on me that I am supposed to leave the leaves. So leaves can actually be a beautiful mulch. And if you have a lot of trees in your backyard, start taking and raking those leaves into your landscape beds, or maybe even trying to blow them into your landscape beds, and just let them decompose. They will build up and be beautiful. So this is just around a cypress tree that's down by our dock. We have this pretty little naturalized retention pond down there, and we have a little dock. And so I started raking these things up, and then I realized I should just leave them because they're actually kind of pretty with their orange color. So leave the leaves. All right. Now, mulch, you can buy it, of course, as you all know, by the bag. You can also buy it by the dump truck full as well, or, you know, you can buy it by the yard. So if you buy it loose, it's going to be a lot less expensive, but it's going to be a lot more back-breaking to apply it. So it's whether you want to go, you know, less expensive but more work, or you don't mind spending a little bit more to get the bagged mulch. So the funny story I was going to tell you all is I actually once ordered the largest pine bark nugget. I called a company, local company. I said, what is the largest pine bark nugget you have? That's what I want to order. And I want 10 cubic yards. 10 cubic yards is a dump truck full. And so when they delivered it, the pine bark nuggets were, they were probably 7 inches long, 8 inches long, and probably about 2 or 3 inches wide. And it's been 10 years and I still have that mulch in my front yard. So I was too embarrassed to send a whole dump truck back to the store. So I took that large nugget mulch and I put it out all over my landscape. And so the larger the nugget size, the longer it's going to last in your landscape. And then mulches, they really only need to be refreshed probably every 2 years. I think people are in this habit of doing it yearly, as this normal thing that they do in the spring or maybe even the winter time when gardening slows down a little bit. And anyhow, all right, so let's talk about the different types of mulch. So, but my point to that was that you really don't have to do it. If you do a 3 to 4 inch layer, you only have to do it every 2 years. So Melaleuca mulch, this is one that you can look for. It is harvested from an invasive tree, so it's pretty cool to take something that's an invasive species and turn it into something that's very, very usable. It can be a little bit harder to find, but I have seen it out on the market. One of the things that's different about it, some people like it, some people don't, is that the Melaleuca will almost bleach out a little bit in the sun and it will really lighten up and get really white looking. So this is what it looks like, what you see on the slide, what it looks like when it is put out into the landscape, and then it fades to a white color. But it has a slow decomposition and it's the least attractive mulch to termites. So that's some of the benefits of it. And then when people think of mulch in their yard, you know, they think of termites here in Florida. You don't have to worry about bringing termites in bags of mulch to your property. So because what happens if termites were to accidentally get into the mulch, they're separated from the queen, they're separated from the the colony, and they will not survive. So don't let that be a concern if you're wanting to bring in mulches into your landscape. But anyhow, Melaleuca is the least attractive mulch that we have to termites. Some other thoughts about termites as well is you want to keep, you don't want any water dripping around the base of your foundation, because if you have mulch there and you have water dripping around the base, that can attract termites. And then with your mulch, you want to keep it at least a foot off the base of the house. All right, pine bark nuggets and pine needles. I tend to like using pine bark nuggets and pine needles. Now, pine bark nuggets, they're going to break down more slowly, and if you pull a bonehead like me and you get the largest nugget that's made, they're going to decompose very slowly. And in fact, pine bark nuggets can decompose so slowly that they really don't build the soil up very quickly because their decomposition is just so slow. But if you get pine bark fines, that can help speed up that decomposition process and help build up your sandy soils. So they're very readily available. Another thing about pine bark and pine needles is they can actually help lower the pH and acidify our soil, which is very, very useful. And then needles are going to decompose very quickly. Remember how I said most of your wood mulches you can just replace every 2 years? Well, with your pine needles, you want to replace them like every 6 months, or maybe you could go a year, but it really starts to look rough in between and they start to break down. But they're really nice for building that soil health. Reggie, do we have any questions or anything on the chat?
No, not yet.
Okay. All right. Well, hopefully you guys are all hanging with me.
Oh, they are. There's
okay, good.
comments and stuff, but no questions that haven't been answered.
Okay, very good. All right, so cypress mulch. Cypress mulch is, we don't recommend it in the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. It's actually a very good mulch, but when they harvest it from the timber industry. Sometimes it's left over from the timber industry, but sometimes it's also from cypress stands. And bald cypress, pond cypress are very, very important wetland species. So it's more of an environmental reason that we do not recommend cypress mulch. But if you go to any extension agent's class in the state and they're talking about using different mulches, they're always going to tell you they don't recommend cypress mulch. And that's more just, again, because it's an important wetland species. So pine is a lot more renewable than cypress. All right, so it does maintain its color and it has a slow decomposition rate, so that's kind of nice about cypress. But again, we're not going to recommend it. All right, rubber mulches. These are made from recycled rubber and tires. We don't really know the composition. It can be highly variable. We don't know, you know, they're not going to decompose. They're not going to add organic matter. So they're really best suited, again, maybe just to a walkway or to a playground. All right, so gravels, pebbles, and stones, I think I touched on this a little bit, but one of the trends that's going on here in Central Florida is people want really low maintenance landscapes. So they think if they do their whole yard or as much as their HOA will allow in stone, then that's going to be really low maintenance. Well, yeah, it's going to be low maintenance, but it does absolutely nothing for building up your soil. Plus, it can reflect and absorb a lot of heat. So it can be really tough on some of your plants. Now, again, I think in small areas, you know, they can be fine. They can be quite beautiful, but you know, not in an overall landscape. And I am actually concerned about some of our developments where they're allowing all rock yards, because these folks are going to have enormous heat in the summertime here in Central Florida. So I bet their heating, I'm sorry, I bet their cooling costs are going to go down greatly when they live in these areas where they're using lots of rock and stone. All right, but here's an example of a Florida-friendly, low-maintenance landscape using some rock, and they've used it sparingly. In this area, they've used it throughout a dry riverbed, but then they have organic mulches, pine bark mulches on the sides. So it can be used. All right, composting. We're going to get away from mulch and we're going to get into composting, gardener's gold. All right, so I'm going to tell on myself actually. My compost pile is the pile that you see on the left with the shovel in it. And I made a really big mistake and I thought, do I show them my home compost pile or do I not? Because I really don't want to show you what I've done wrong. But anyway, all right, so the big thing that I have done with my compost pile is I was doing a landscape project and I had too much dirt left over. And so I stuck it into my compost pile, and I think that was a mistake. And it really kind of, I think, has almost like slowed the decomposition, maybe not slowed the decomposition of things, but slowed the formation of really nice compost, because now I've got all the sand that I'm dealing with in my compost pile. And it was a mistake that I think I made, even though this has more organic matter than our typical dry, sandy soils here, it's still not this dark, beautiful, what we call friable, which is where you can break apart the soil easily in your hand. That's what I'm going for, the picture on the right, of course. So anyhow, what I think I'm going to do is start over. I think I'm going to take all the sand mixed with compost once everything breaks down, and I think I'm just going to scatter it over some areas of my yard because I think it's still going to be okay if I do it in a light layer. And again, it's going to have some organic matter, but I'm actually going to start over. So, and this is just fencing. I'll talk to you all about how you can do this. This cost me about $13 to make this. And then on the other side of my compost pile, I have a plumbago, which is really big and it blocks the view so nobody can see it from the street, which I think is really important. People get funny about compost piles. All right, so let's talk about compost. It's the partially decomposed remains of plants and organic materials, and composting is you actually controlling that decomposition. You controlling it, and you're also being aided greatly by those microorganisms, right? Because it wouldn't happen, it wouldn't break down without them. And then humus is the final state of that decomposition. And that's what we're all going for. That's the gardener's gold. That's where it's nice and rich, like the picture in the previous slide. So, why? Some other reasons to compost. We all know that it can improve the soil, especially clay soils like you might experience in Appalachia, Georgia, Tennessee area, and then our dry, sandy soils here in Florida. It helps build them up and it helps break down clayey soils. So, compost is a real miracle worker no matter what your soil type. And we do have hot pockets of clay in Lake and Sumter counties near the Villages area that are actually naturally existing. So, all right, so you're recycling your yard and kitchen waste, so you can give yourself a pat on the back for helping to recycle. You're improving your soil's water holding capacity. You're improving the structure and the porosity of the soil. You're helping to support living organisms. And, we're getting into research, about beneficial fungi and beneficial bacteria, and there's so much research as far as healthy soils go. So anytime you can support living organisms, no matter how big or small. All right, so it can actually help. Your compost is like a slow release fertilizer. You can think of it in that frame of mind. And then it can actually buffer your soils as well. And then it can help improve plant and root growth and help suppress disease. And this is the area suppressing disease where we're, doing a lot of research. All right, so what can be composted? Your leaves and your yard waste, compost, compost, compost. But if you're going to be doing larger limbs, twigs, things like that, you really need to chip them up or physically cut them up before you put them in the compost pile. So a common problem that has happened at, at the Bushnell demonstration garden where I worked in Sumter County, we started a big composting project, and what happened was it turned into a brush pile because everybody wanted to compost it, but we didn't have a chipper. So it wasn't easy for people to break it down. So we ended up with brush piles all in this compost education area. So we had one master gardener, he was so cute. He would get up at every single one of our meetings and he would say, "Hi, my name is so-and-so, and please, if you're going to put anything into the compost pile, cut it into 3-inch pieces." And every meeting he would say it, and every meeting everyone knew what he was about to say. And he helped turn it around, actually. And we have a beautiful compost pile at our Discovery Gardens now, too. All right, so leaves and yard waste, grass and lawn clippings. You can do wood chips sparingly, and you can do sawdust sparingly, and you really need to do the sawdust very sparingly. All right, you can also do your kitchen waste, of course. And I think the kitchen waste, it provides a lot of nitrogen, and I don't think you can put enough kitchen waste in your compost pile here in Florida because things just break down so quickly. And then also you can use things like paper, any of those brown paper towels or the paper towel rolls, the cardboard paper towel rolls. Sometimes I'll throw that in there just to add some bulk or actually to kind of increase the airflow in a compost pile. So you can, do thin pieces of cardboard, that type of thing. Again, sparingly. And then any of your manures, rabbit, cow, and horse specifically. Again, as we talked, I believe last week, chicken manures can sometimes have added some chemicals that you may not want in your compost pile. So you want to know what those chickens were eating. If they were eating things like, and then it can also be very hot, but if they were eating things that are very, like insects and veggies and things like that, it would probably be fine to use. But again, poultry manure can get very hot. So you have to watch the nitrogen with that. But yes.
Good question here.
Okay.
What kind of kitchen waste, besides the food in the picture, like veggies, what else can be used and should not be used?
Okay, so you can use orange peelings, you can use eggshells. Eggshells, definitely. You can use, any kind of fruit. I can't think of any kitchen waste. Actually, hang on a minute. Let's get into what there's more that you can compost than more than you can't compost, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. So, any of your leafy greens, any of your veggies, any of your fruit, those are all fine for compost pile. I would not put things like bread or cooked rice or things like that in a compost pile. It's just the breads and things like that are very, very processed. And then, of course, you don't want to do any kind of pet waste unless it's a rabbit. You don't want to do any kind of chemically treated wood products. And for that matter, if you're going to use your compost for edibles, make sure you're not using plant material that you've sprayed with pesticides in your landscape, unless that pesticide's labeled for food crops. So that's something to think about. But really, I found that you don't have to, you don't have to apply a lot of pesticides in the Florida landscape. So, but anyhow, all right, you don't want to do the meat, bones, or fatty foods, and you don't want to do dairy products. Another thing, unless you turn into a master composter, and there is actually a master composter program. I'm not sure if it's still active, but we had one at one time in Florida. But anyhow, you're probably not going to manage your pile to where things get hot enough to where you can put diseased plants or weeds. So I might sometimes put green parts of a weed in my garden, but I'm not going to put anything that's gone to seed if it's a weed, or any kind of weed that spreads on runners. I am not going to put that in my compost pile. I'm actually going to put it with my landscape debris to get hauled out of here, because I don't want to spread any of those weeds, and I don't want to spread diseases either. So but if you become a master composter, and that's where you really learn how to compost, and you can get your pile really, really hot, you can put in some of those diseased plants or weeds. All right, so some of the things to think about is moisture, aeration, the pile temperature too, and then the particle size. We really don't want anything more than 3 inches to be in that compost pile. And then another thing that we'll get into a little bit more detail is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And this gets into more of some of those things that are really good to compost, and maybe some not so good to compost. All right, so moisture. You are trying to keep your microbes, you're trying to keep all those beneficial fungi and beneficial bacteria going, and they need moisture in order to thrive. So the ideal moisture is about 40 to 60%. How the heck are you going to know that when you're out in your garden? You actually want your compost to feel moist, but you don't want it to be soggy. So you don't want to be able to squeeze any water out of it, but you want to feel that it's moist. And then you can add your moisture as you're building your pile, or add some water to it once a week if we don't get rainfall. So you just want to check and keep it moist. Don't let it get too dry, or sometimes that can slow down the process. And then aeration. You definitely have to have oxygen for those microbes to work too. So whenever you can aerate the pile by turning it, or by adding maybe just a few bulky items, it can help, like maybe some smaller twigs, stems, or like those paper towel rolls that I had mentioned earlier. So you want to, okay, so somebody asked me, actually I got this email this morning. Someone said, how often should I turn my compost pile? Because some sources say to turn it every single day, and some say weekly, and some say every 2 weeks. It really all depends, but every day is way too much, because you want to get heat built up into that pile, and I think it's hard to get that heat built up into the pile if you're doing every day. So I think a good rule of thumb, although it can vary greatly, a good rule of thumb for here in Florida is probably once a week. All right, so your pile temperature is going to
Brooke,
depend. Yes.
sorry.
No, go
A
for it.
couple of questions have come up.
Mm-hmm.
Good questions. Let's see. All right, the person who asked about compost bins, we will get into that. One fellow wants to know if a lawn is treated with pesticides. Of course, you said don't use it, but what if it's treated with an herbicide?
I would not use it. I would not use it. But what you can do is you can actually recycle that just by keeping your lawn clippings on site, and don't bag them up, don't get rid of them, but keep them on site and let them help build up your turf grass. So we have a beautiful St. Augustine backyard. Very rarely do I fertilize it, but what we do is we try to mow on a frequent enough basis to where the clippings are small, and then we just leave them, and we let them we let them decompose and help build up the soil for healthy turf grass. So I would say but if your yard clippings are not being treated with anything, then you could use them, sure, absolutely, but not if there's weeds in it. So
And the second question has to
sure.
do with moisture.
Okay.
Rainy season's coming. Do we have to cover the compost
Mm,
pile?
That's a
And how much will that lower the temperature?
Okay, that's a very good question. I don't know if I have a good answer for you on the temperature part, but I think in Florida it's a good idea to have some type of cover on your compost pile. Is it necessary? No, but you know, we can get torrential downpours multiple days of a week sometimes here in Central Florida, and you can get to where your compost gets waterlogged and soggy, and it will start to smell because now you're not doing aerobic respiration where your organisms are using oxygen. You're actually doing anaerobic respiration, and it can get really stinky, and yeah, it's just not good. So if there, you know, even if if you know that we're going to get a lot of a downpour of rain, if you can just go and put a tarp over it or something like that. But we actually, when I worked for Sumter County in their demonstration garden, we actually built compost piles where you could slide the top in and out, and that was really nice. So you could do that. Now, they were some pretty nice compost piles, I have to tell you. So all right, so for your pile temperature, for those of you that really want to get into composting, I would recommend getting a compost thermometer and measuring the inside of that pile because your most effective range for composting is 122 to 131 degrees, but you want to crank the temperature on your pile to about 140 degrees to destroy your diseases and your weed seeds. So and you can do this very easily. And you all have probably experienced this driving down the turnpike or 75 or another major highway somewhere in the country where you actually see where they have, you know, cleared the area and they've chipped up all these large trees, and you can actually see the mulch piles and the wood chip piles on fire because they get so hot. So I think that's going to be very rare that a compost pile would be that big or that hot in the homeowner's yard. But it does happen. Again, not in the homeowner's yard, but you know, places where they sell mulch and are doing clearing and that type of thing. All right, so your particle size. Again, you want to get your particles 3 inches or less in size. You don't want to turn it into a brush pile. And I've seen this happen so many times. And like I mentioned before, we had done this too. So the smaller the particle size, the faster it's going to compost down. And this is kind of funny. I think my next big purchase that I want to make is actually wood chipper. I just told my husband I really, really want to get a small wood chipper because I feel that I remove a lot of landscape debris out here where I'm removing things that are just way too big to compost down. And when I sit there and hand do it, as far as cutting all these stems in small pieces, it takes forever. So a lot of times they never make it to my compost pile. So I really want to get a very small wood chipper just to have so that I can, you know, not have to go buy any compost. I can use my compost on site, and I also won't have to go and buy any mulch either. I had a master gardener that had, he lived in the villages, and he had a small wood chipper in his garage, and his plants were gorgeous. His soil was gorgeous, and he just took and chipped everything in his wood chipper and then just laid it out as mulch in his yard, and it was so beautiful. So if you really want to get into it, I think this is a really good way to go. So again, I want to buy one. So we'll see. I haven't compared prices or anything like that. Particles can be too small, so you do need to be cautious because sawdust actually, you can put down light layers of sawdust, but you don't want to put down heavy layers because they have so much carbon in them. And it's just not going to be good for aeration. So be very cautious with sawdust. Will it break down? Yeah, eventually, but it could take it a long time. So let's talk about carbon to nitrogen ratio. So your carbon and your carbon is like an energy source for the microbes because again, you're trying to keep good bacteria and good fungi going. And your nitrogen is actually the raw building blocks for their DNA and for the protein for those microbes. So you want a good carbon to nitrogen balance to keep those microorganisms happy and flourishing. So these are your browns and your greens. And what's funny is I remember my papa, my grandfather from South Georgia that taught me a lot about gardening. He would always say, you've got to have brown for the carbon and you have to have greens for the nitrogen. And then when you're looking at ingredients as far as what to put into a compost pile, the optimum carbon to nitrogen ratio is 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen or less. Now, you all aren't going to remember this, or you might remember it. You might remember it, but you're not going to be, how many parts carbon to nitrogen do I think this product is, or this landscape clippings that I want to put in here. You're going to really have no way of knowing. So here's just to give you an idea. These are some of the products that have a really good carbon to nitrogen ratio and some that have a not so good carbon to nitrogen ratio. So let's look at the things. So coffee grounds, people get concerned about these. I had another email this week that said, can you tell me about coffee grounds from the gardens? Some sources say they're good. Some sources say they're not so good. All the university research that I have seen says that coffee grounds are absolutely beautiful for the garden. So, you can actually, I'm almost regretting that I'm about to tell you this, but you can actually go to your local coffee shop and ask them for their grounds. I like to do this. And anyhow, the most famous coffee shop, I won't say their name, but they have grounds for the gardens, and you can walk right in there. Whenever I go and get a cup of coffee or cappuccino or whatever it might be, I grab a bag of grounds for my gardens. So anyhow, so get those coffee grounds. They're great. Cow manure is fabulous. Again, all of this has to break down before you put it on your plants. Grass clippings are fine as long as they're not treated with a pesticide or an herbicide for that matter. And then table scraps are really good too. So again, you're looking for 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen or less. Corn stalks, they're pretty thick, they're pretty fibrous, they're pretty high there, but look at sawdust and wood. So this is why you want to use mulch and sawdust very sparingly. They are 600 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And sometimes what I've seen people do is they put too much wood product or sawdust into their compost pile, and then it just sits there and it takes so long to break down. And if you've done this, if you've made this mistake, you can actually add a nitrogen fertilizer to kickstart that decomposition. But you're getting into some synthetic fertilizers to add to your compost pile. That's not a typical recommendation, but again, if you have just a lot of carbon type materials, straw can be kind of heavy at 80 to 1. Check out oak leaves. I love to use oak leaves in my landscape as mulch, and I love to use them in my compost pile because they are about as close to that carbon nitrogen ratio as you get. They're 26 parts of the carbon and 1 part nitrogen. So very, very beautiful. And then pine needles are pretty darn good too. Newspaper can be 50 to 100, so use newspaper sparingly. If you want to use newspaper, do it in thin layers, and then only use if it is soy-based ink or if it's black and white ink. So I still don't know about the colors, if you can use the colored newspaper in a compost pile, if it's recommended. I've heard not a big deal, but I don't know. So stick to black and white. And stick to cereal boxes and things that are printed with using the soy-based ink. All right, so browns, these are going to decompose very slowly unless you mix them with greens. Again, they provide carbon. Examples are straw, chipped branches, tree trimmings, paper, sawdust. But again, you got to add a lot of nitrogen to some of these things. Oh, another thing that I think is important to point out, my husband worked in pest control for many years, and he always told me if he saw a rat in the compost pile was going away. But I've always kept it to where I have never even seen a rat, and he hasn't either. So we've had no issues with our compost pile, so to speak. And so anyway, but one of the things that I do is whenever I add to my compost pile, I always add a layer of brown materials, or if I don't have brown materials handy, I will take that yard and kitchen waste and I will bury it deep into the pile and then cover it up. So you want to top your pile with a layer of brown material, or just make sure you bury your things deep so that you don't attract flies, rodents, some of those pest critters that are out there. And again, your greens, they're going to decompose quickly. They provide that nitrogen. Nitrogen moves very easily and it changes forms very, very easily. Greens can be high in moisture as well. So, and you see some of the examples of that: grass, green leaves, kitchen scraps, manure, inorganic fertilizers, coffee grounds. Those are all examples. Okay, so coffee ground is not green in color, right? It's brown in color, but because of the carbon nitrogen ratio, it's considered a green. It's considered something that has a lot of nitrogen in it. So again, very good for the home compost pile. How are we doing on that chat, Reggie?
Doing good.
Okay, good deal. Okay, so who are the players of the pile? Microbes and bacteria and fungi, those are what you're really trying to support. These are the things that are going to help break things down, and then your insects and your worms, your larger creatures, are going to come in when that compost pile is finishing, when it's kind of curing, so to speak. All right, so these are some of the microbes that we have, some of the bacteria. Now, we don't have too many psychrophiles. This is like cold loving is what that means. We don't have too many psychrophiles in Florida. Their optimum temperature is around 55 degrees. They produce a little bit of heat. We have a lot of mesophiles probably in Florida. They're the real workers of the pile. So they thrive from 70 to 90 degrees. And they don't really survive out of that range. So we probably have a lot of these in our compost piles in Florida. And then once we start really cranking up the heat in that compost pile in the center, then your thermophiles come in, and these bacteria work pretty fast. 104, and they can work at temperatures of 104 to 200 degrees. And if you really get that heat built up in the center of your pile, you can have compost in a week. It's amazing. 3 to 5 days, they can break things down. So it just really amazes me how quickly this whole process can happen, especially in Florida. Okay, so actinomycetes. That took me a while to figure out how to say it. Actinomycetes. Anyway, these are a filament-forming bacteria. These are really good to have in your compost pile as well. If you have ever worked in mulch, especially I see this a lot with that cypress mulch, and you've worked in the mulch and you notice something that looks like a gray or a white cobweb, it is not harmful. It is actually a bacteria that forms a filament and helps break down all of that mulch. So that's what's supposed to be happening. Sometimes in our mulch, it can actually form a mat, and so people kind of complain about that. But just take a stiff rake and break up that mulch, and that will kind of break up the mat. This critter, the actinomycetes, they actually break down lignin and cellulose, which is the real fibrous stuff in our plant material. And they also give that nice, pleasing, earthy smell to our soils. All right, so as the pile cools, these are some of the players that come in. We get nematodes, and there's good nematodes and bad nematodes. We get springtails, centipedes, sow bugs, pill bugs, ground beetles are some of those things that you can expect when that pile is cool and ready. So you will see other critters too. And then earthworms, they move into the pile, and even my nephew knows that earthworms are good for the soil and good for the plants. But anyhow, earthworms move into the compost pile when it cools, and they really help process and incorporate the organic matter. And I think a lot of people think earthworms are really part of that soil building process, and they are, but the bacteria is huge, and the fungi are huge too. All right, but they're going to also help give structure and porosity, and they're going to aerate the compost pile too. So when you have earthworms, always good to have. It's a good indicator of good soil quality. Another mention that I would like to tell you all about, since if you're listening to compost and you sat in on our vegetable class, we had this situation in our children's garden where we had all of our beds and we were putting potting soil in all of our beds, and we were putting layers of mulch down for our walkways. And what was really funny is one of the master gardeners said, we have more earthworms in our walkways than we do in our plant beds. And so what we ended up doing, because our plant beds were kind of rotten and we needed to replace anyway, we ended up putting our plant beds where all of our wood mulch walkways were. And then we turned where our plant beds were, where we had all that potting soil, into the walkway. And we had a beautiful harvest. So it was one of those things where it was kind of a no-duh moment. We were using all this sterile potting soil, and we had all this mulch that had been piled up for years that created a really beautiful soil. And once we saw those worms, we just knew what we had to do. All right, so there's different types of composting methods. There's cold or slow composting. I'm kind of a lazy composter. This is probably what I do. This is what my grandfather did. He had in his garden in Georgia, he had all these piles that he just had going. Now, it might take him 2 or 3 years for a pile to be done composting, because he just did something called heap composting. And that's where you just throw everything in a pile, you don't manage it, you top it off with a layer of straw or leaves, and you just let it break down. But he had 10 acres, and he was in a wooded area, and so he had maybe 8 piles going at a time. So he was still doing composting, just a very slow process. But hey, each year he had 1 or 2 piles to pull from. So another thing that I've heard of gardeners doing is trench composting, and that's where they simply take and they do a trench around the drip line of a plant, and then they put their compost and their compost materials in around the drip line. And then there's cold bin composting. This is basically just heap composting, except you're sticking it in a bin. There's really not that much of a difference. Most of us will probably do something like this, or we'll do something in between a cold compost pile and a hot compost pile. That's probably what I do. So if you really want to start cranking up the heat and you really want to get that gardener's gold really fast, you can do the hot or the fast composting method. With this, you need at least a cubic yard of material. So you want 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. So 3 foot tall, 3 foot wide, 3 foot deep. You want a really good blend of greens and browns. Again, not too many browns or it's going to take a while for it to break down. And you want a nice moisture. Again, you want it kind of evenly moist but not saturated. And then you're going to do frequent turning, probably once a week, if not once every 3-5 days. And then you don't want any particle size less than 2 to 3 inches in a hot or fast composting. I actually want to improve, and I want to get better at doing the hot or fast composting. And I need to just go ahead and buy one of those thermometers, because sometimes if you just go ahead and buy it like a good pair of running shoes, you might actually use it. So maybe by buying that compost thermometer, I'll get into doing more hot and fast composting. All right, so whenever you add more to a pile, you want to bury the new material deep into the pile. And just at some point though, you have to stop composting in that pile because you need to let it finish, you need to let it cure. So I think it's a good idea to have about 3 compost piles going in your yard, or 3 compost bin. So you want to have a compost bin where you are curing it, you're letting it sit. You want a compost bin where you are pulling from, so it's already composted down, and then you want a compost pile that you are adding to. So that's important to know. At some point you have to stop adding and you have to start letting it cure and using it. So managing the pile. If it smells, turn it. If you have any kind of odor, add moisture to it as you build. And then if your temperature is too high, over 150 degrees, I congratulate you, you're doing really good. Turn it. If it's less than 100 degrees, turn it. So turning the compost pile really does a lot. And then again, if your compost pile is smelling, which can sometimes happen, it's either getting way too wet or you're not burying your food waste deep enough into the pile. So think about those things. But again, you turn it to reheat it, you turn it to add oxygen, you turn it to destroy undesirables because you are constantly putting things into the center of that pile, and then you're breaking up any clumps or layers. And then also you turn it to help keep the smell down as well. All right, we're in the home stretch. We're almost finished here, and I'll take some more questions. Do we have any questions right now, Reggie? Or still doing good?
Still doing good.
Okay, so again, you have to let it cure or finish. You want to allow that pile to cool. You don't want to add any more material to it. And this is when the earthworms are going to start showing up. This can take, depending on where you live, depending on our temperatures, rainfall, those types of things, it can take 1 month to a year. In Florida, probably not a year. You can actually, one master gardener I know from Sumter, she would actually take and she would filter out her compost, and she'd filter out all the big stuff by using a screen like you see here over this wheelbarrow. And then just some more helpful tips. If you're going to use leaves, they have a waxy coating on them. So run over the leaves with the lawnmower before you add them to the pile, which is very counterintuitive because if you rake up your leaves and then take a lawnmower to them, what are you going to have to do again? You're going to have to rake up your leaves, right? Keep a pitchfork on site so you can very easily turn it, and plan your compost pile close to a water source so that if we do get really dry and droughty, you can help keep those microbes going. All right, worm composting. This is another thing that some gardeners have really gotten into. My grandfather did this as well a little bit, and actually did this in college too. So what we did is we got two Rubbermaid containers, and we actually cut holes in the bottom of the top container, and then in the bottom container we would put our newspaper in our worms, and that was their bedding area. And then in the top container, yeah, there were some large holes, but this is where we would put our food scraps and our manures. We were doing a study to see what manures from our animal science department was best for worms to compost. So anyhow, so the worms would crawl down from the bedding material down here, and they would crawl through the holes, and then they would be in the food waste up here. And when I did this project, it was before smartphones, so I wish I had some pictures to show you all. But anyhow, so worms can eat a pound of food waste very, very quickly. What we found in that study is that the horse manure was the best as far as food waste goes. And I think the pig manure was too hot for the worms, and cow manure was fine too, but the horse manure seemed to be the best. All right, so which worms? Red wigglers, African night crawlers, and you can have 2 pounds of worms will eat about a pound of kitchen scraps a day. So I haven't done this in quite some time, but we have some master gardeners that do worm composting, and they usually keep them in their garage. All right, so let's talk about the uses of your compost. You can use it as a soil amendment, almost like a mulch. Again, it's going to increase your organic matter, and it's going to help build up those sandy soils, help break down those clay soils. So you can, again, like I said, use it as a mulch. You can use it as a potting mix. Although if it is too rich in organic matter, holds too much water, you may want to incorporate some other type of soil with it, like a potting soil. And then you can also make compost tea, which is where you would take this compost and with a 5-gallon bucket of water or whatever, it could be a watering can too, it doesn't have to be a 5-gallon bucket, but you can take your compost and put it in like a cheesecloth or a burlap bag, and then you can set it down in the water. And this can be like a very, very low, slow release fertilizer. And then let's talk about some of the composting units that you can get. You can purchase these little cage composters, and they can be really inexpensive, 30 bucks or less. And they're real easy. One thing I like about them is they're easy to break down. So if you've got your compost pile, it's ready to cure, you can break it down and let that pile continue to cure and start a new pile right next to it. So I like that round one in the bottom there. This is another one that most homeowners that live in an HOA will probably have, or some other deed restricted community. Now your HOA, I believe we have a Florida Friendly Landscaping Senate bill. They cannot tell you that you can't compost, but they can tell you what it's going to look like. So if you live in an area with a strict HOA, they can tell you that you can have a compost pile, but it has to be in one of these types of compost bins, and it has to be painted the same color as your house so that it doesn't really stick out. So that's something that's very common. And so this is the one that you would typically see if you live in an HOA. All right, so the approximate cost of this is 40 to 100 bucks. So what you do is you pile everything in the top, you pull up this little drawer, and you harvest from below. If you are doing edibles, you want to make sure that everything is, you don't recognize anything in the pile before you put it onto your edibles. Now, if you're just doing landscape, I might pull some compost early. You know, you can pull up this little door here and just keep taking from the bottom. But the thing that I think is a struggle with this one is you can't really, it's really hard to turn with a pitchfork or a shovel. So anyhow, but it may be your only option in some areas. These are just some other examples. Here's the soil saver, which is very similar. This one they call the earth machine too. You just put everything in the top, and it's almost like a slow or a cold composter, and then you pull from the bottom when it's ready and unrecognizable. And then this is the 3-bin unit. This is what most of your growers, most of your universities will have, or nurseries. This is what we have at Discovery Gardens now. And this is that 3-bin system that I was telling you about. And it looks like that they're not really using this one actively right now, but you would have one bin again that you are pulling from because it's ready, another bin that's curing, you're not adding to it, and then the other bin you're adding to. And you can make these very, very easy with pallets. You can do concrete block here. At Discovery Gardens, we actually found a blueprint to make a concrete block one, but what we did that's different from this is we actually let left gaps in our concrete blocks so that we could get some more airflow into it. So, but this is really common if you have some land and or if you're a commercial producer. This is what I have in my yard, and I built it for less than 15 bucks. It's just fencing that you would get from one of the big, hardware box stores. The orange one and the blue one, if you catch my drift. But anyhow, you can just take these metal fencing stakes and you can hammer them into the ground. I have modified this. I saw this little plan online somewhere, and I found that this was really hard to turn. So I actually cut this plastic fencing on here and here so that I could get in and turn my compost in this area. So, and then it's very easy to measure this off and make it that 3 tall by 3 wide by 3 deep pile size. So this is what I'm using, and like I said, I want to kind of redo my compost pile and get started again, but this works just fine. And if nothing else, you don't have to have it contained, just pile it up somewhere. So this is another one that has a big crank on it. I think that these things are kind of hard to deal with because if you get too much or if you get a lot of compost in there, it's hard to crank. So anyhow, just something to keep in mind. And then this one is a compost tumbler. You put the stuff in it, you put the door on it, and you actually just take your hands and roll this along these wheels. So that could be an option too, if you have issues with your back especially. And then this one is one that we saw online, and we tried it. We weren't crazy about it, but we tried it. So what we did is we drilled holes all on the side of it, and we put our compost materials in. And then what you're supposed to do to mix it is you're supposed to take and roll this around the ground. Well, what happens when you get soil that's 3/4 the way up? It gets too heavy to lift it back up. So anyway, you could do it if you want, but I like that fencing that I showed you earlier. So there's really, when it gets down to it, I'm talking about carbon nitrogen ratio, I'm talking about 40 to 60% moisture, 2 to 3 inch particle size. Everything will compost over time. So there's really only 2 rules to composting. Don't throw away your yard and kitchen waste, and pile it up somewhere. So it doesn't have to be difficult. So everything's going to break down eventually. All right, so what questions do we have? Is there anything I did not address that you guys would like some more information about as far as composting goes?
There are no new questions. Folks, if you have any, please put them in the chat room so Brooke can answer them.
And then what we will do is we'll do the same thing that we've been doing each week, where I will send you all links that are appropriate for this talk. And then let me do that poll again. Oh, hang on a minute. See if you learned anything, although you guys kind of nailed it the first time.
Brooke, someone
Yes.
wants to know, is it possible to compost something too long?
I think it can be. I think in most of the country, probably no. But when we're in this hot, humid climate, I have found that the microbes break down things so quickly that sometimes it can be hard to keep compost going. So I think as soon as you have something that is dark, it's friable, you don't recognize it, go ahead and use it. The microbes will break down compost and organic organisms very, very quickly here in Central Florida. So that's actually a really good question. You're making me think. You're making my brain hurt a little bit. Any other questions that we may have?
Someone came a little late and missed recommendations regarding pine straw. And a 2-part of that is, earlier someone said they got moths when they used pine straw. So
that's bizarre. I've never heard of actually having moths, but it could happen. I mean, you've got this organic product. So anyhow, using pine straw for mulch, I think overall is a really good recommendation because it really builds our soils very, very quickly, and it helps to acidify our soils, which is what most of us need in Central Florida. We tend to have 2 alkaline soils, so acidity is something we need. So I can't speak highly enough about pine straw, really, as far as just its benefits in Florida. But could you bring fire ants in on pine straw? Sure. I guess you can bring moths that happen to you, right? So you could bring in some pests, but it shouldn't be anything that once you use the mulch would be long term. Hopefully I answered that for you. Any other questions you all might have?
Yes, you had touched upon rodents earlier, but someone wants to know, how do you prevent it?
Okay, so I really don't have rodent problems with my compost pile, and I really think it's because whenever I add my kitchen scraps, I put it really deep into the pile, and I just mound the rest of the compost that's kind of, you know, somewhat finished on top of that. The other thing you can do is, if you have any leaves in your yard, brown leaves, or if you do have pine straw, you could even get a bale of pine straw or a couple bales of pine straw just to have it by the side of your compost pile, to wherever you add things, you put a layer of pine straw on top. You're just making it harder for the rodents and some of those pests to get to. And then also you're blocking the smell. So what you're doing when you're using those brown materials and you're burying things deep into the pile is you're helping to mask those smells. So that will really keep the attractiveness down. I actually have had more rabbits in my compost pile, or on the outsides of my compost pile. If I don't bury something deep enough and some celery gets out, or, you know, something like that, I have noticed rabbits, but no rodents, thankfully.
Okay, another question.
Okay.
If you want to use your compost just to plant in, do you need to add other things like bone meal or Epsom salt?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so here's the deal. When you are, okay, if I think in most landscapes, we actually don't need to use a lot of fertilizer at all, unless our plants are nutrient deficient. And in that case, you would want to add something. But I think, you know, just adding some compost is going to be, it's going to help build up that soil. It's going to be a slow release fertilizer for you. And I would only do that unless your plants are showing signs of a nutrient deficiency. And what nutrient deficiencies look like is they look like a pattern in the leaves. So if you could take that leaf and you could fold it in half, you would see matching on both sides, and that is a sign that you have a nutrient deficiency. And in that case, yeah, you might add blood meal or bone meal if you're doing organic, or you might add a synthetic fertilizer if you're not doing organic gardening. Um, so hopefully that helps. I think we tend to fertilize a little too much in our landscapes. I don't fertilize most of my plants, and they seem to do just fine, but I do have a palm that requires some fertilization. So I do fertilize that, and I fertilize a couple other little things, but I really don't use a lot in the landscape. So only fertilize if it's shown a nutrient deficiency, or if you're trying to push new growth. Now, when I say that, when you are doing a vegetable garden, okay, this is good. I'm glad that you asked me this question, because when you're doing a vegetable garden, I don't think you can add enough compost, and you're going to have to add some organic materials too in your vegetable garden. So if that was more of what you were getting at versus landscape plants, then I would say yes, you're going to have to add some things to it, either a whole lot of compost or some other things as well. Any other questions? Okay, well, I tell you what, I'm going to end the poll. You guys did great, 100%. So you did, some of you learned a little something, so that's cool. But thank you for hanging with me. Again, next week we are going to do water-wise landscapes. So we're going to be talking more about ornamental plants, and then the following week we're going to do attracting wildlife, and then after that we're going to have a whole new batch of classes for you. So I'm excited about that. I think we're even going to cover chickens, so I'm going to get the livestock agent on here, and she's going to talk about chickens, raising chickens within the coming month. So thank you all for your attention, and Reggie, if there's not anything else, I'm going to go ahead and exit the meeting.
Nope, nothing else. Everybody says thanks and great content.
Okay, good. Thank you. Appreciate it. I'll send some links to you too. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Brooke.
Bye, Wanda.